Now let's look at some of our important vector drawing tools, starting with the pencil tool. If we look over here in our tool properties, we can see the options that we have. I'm going to start by selecting a pencil from this list. I like pencil 3. If I want to customize it, I have a couple options available here, and if I double click on this, I have more options in here. Now the pencil tool has pressure sensitivity if you're using a tablet. So here I can define the maximum size in pixels and the minimum size as a percent. And you can see in our preview, it gives us an idea of how fat or skinny or sharp our pencil line can be. There's additional options here for smoothing. This determines how much Harmony is going to automatically smooth out your vector lines. You'll just have to play around with those to get a feel for how much they affect things. I'm usually fine just leaving them at the default. We also have some options here for how we want our lines to start and end. You probably want that round if you're going for a realistic hand-drawn effect. And then here there's options for how it joins up to other lines. You probably want to leave this on round too. You also have the option to add a texture to your line. You can choose from one of the presets here to give your line a sense of texture when you draw. Let's see what this looks like. There, that looks pretty cool. If we wanted to save this brush, we would just click this Add button. Let's give it a name. And then it appears at the bottom of our list here. If we want to get back to one of our other pencils, we just select it from the presets again. You can make as many pencils as you want this way. Also down here at the bottom of the list are some important options for how the pencil functions. Let's look at this first one. Draw behind. I'm going to pick a different color so we can see the effect. By default, when you draw, it goes over top of whatever is already there. If you enable this option, it will go behind existing artwork instead. Next, let's look at this option, the Automatically Create Color Art option. This has to do with our separate line art and color art layers. Let's go to the Drawing tab so we can see better. If this option is enabled and I draw something on the line art layer, it's automatically going to add a stroke to the color art layer. This is so you can use the Paint Bucket tool to fill things in on the color art layer easily. I would personally leave this off, because you're probably going to end up with a lot of stray strokes on your color art layer. We'll look at a different way to transfer strokes from the line art to the color art layer later. Next, let's look at this option, the Auto Flatten option. We talked before about the fact that if you make several different brush strokes, they're still all selectable individually with the selection tool. However, if Auto Flatten is on, it's automatically going to merge your lines at the intersections, so you won't actually be able to select entire strokes with the selection tool, just segments. I personally prefer to keep my strokes separate. Next, let's talk about this option, the Auto Close Gap option. If I have this enabled, and let's say I try to draw a circle, now it looks like I left a gap there. But if I hit K to turn on my vectors, you can see it's actually closed it with a small invisible vector line. This would let me fill that with the Paint Bucket tool even though there's a gap there. I would generally recommend keeping this off though. There are better solutions for the gap problem, and you might run into lines that you don't want. For example, let's say I try to draw a face here. You can see it sticking in all these extra strokes where things are too close. That can actually mess up your coloring. Next, let's look at this option, Line Building Mode. If this is turned on, and I start making a series of strokes, you can see that it's actually joining the vectors together. So if you're trying to outline something, but can't do it in one stroke, you might want to turn on this option. These last two options here have to do with adjusting existing line work. So let's say I have a stroke already on the stage. And let's say I think this end is a little too thin. In that case, I could use this option, the Auto Adjust Thickness option. If I click this, it actually gives me a sort of new tool. If I click and drag, it's going to thicken up the area of the line that I highlight. And it's going to try to do it smoothly so that it matches with the rest of the line. Then this option over here is similar. With this option, if I come in and draw over a line, it's going to nudge the stroke in the direction of my new stroke. It's a pretty subtle effect, so you might be better off just using the selection tool. Next, let's talk about the paintbrush tool. If we come over and look in our tool properties, we can see that it looks very much the same as with the pencil tool. We have some presets, some basic options here, and if you double click, you get more options in this window. These are all the same as with the pencil tool option. You can even add paper textures as well. However, along the bottom we have a few different options. Our first one is Draw Behind again. This works the same as with the pencil tool. If you have that enabled, all your strokes will go behind what's already there. This next option is new though. It's called the Repaint Brush. If this is enabled, our strokes will only go where there's already paint. This is useful for recoloring something that you've already colored in. These next two are the same ones we've seen before. The Automatically Create Color Art feature will put strokes that you make on your line art onto the color layer automatically, and the Auto Flatten feature will merge all the strokes you make into one shape automatically. Our next option is on by default, and it's called Respect Protected Color. So what's a protected color? Well, if we come down to our color palette and right-click, we have an option, Protect Color. Then let's say we have Auto Flatten on, so we're actually painting in the color. And we go to paint over these two squares. You can see it's painted over the blue, but not the green, because this green is a protected color. It's probably best to leave that on by default. Our last option here is called Use Stored Color Gradient. This is a little tricky to understand, but let's say I have a color gradient that I'm painting with. So by default, it's going to scale the gradient to whatever the size of the object you draw is. So you can see these all start with the light blue and go to the dark blue within each shape. However, if I use the selection tool, let's say I like the position of this gradient, and I want to store that color gradient with this option. Now, if I come back to my paintbrush and enable this, when I go to paint, it's going to base the position of the gradient off the one that was stored in this one. So you can see the light blues are all lining up here and the dark blues are all lining up here. Next, let's talk about these shape tools down here. You can see we have a line, rectangle, ellipse, or polyline. These all work in a very similar way. Let's start with the line. So you can see our Tools property panel looks a lot like our pencil panel. We have a bunch of presets, some options, and more options down here. And again, if you double click on the stroke preview, you get additional options here. Now, a lot of these are based on pen pressure, which isn't relevant when you're using these tools. But you still can have dynamic thickness on these lines. We'll look at that in a second. So by default, you just click and drag to make a line. Now this pencil I'm using has a fixed thickness, but the presets down here with this icon actually have a dynamic thickness. So this one is called tapered end. So you see it starts thicker and gets thinner. Some of these other ones have even more dynamics. This one is curved above. So you can use these presets as a base for making your own sorts of pencils. Just like other pencil strokes, you can add textures to these as well. As for the options down here, these are mostly the same as the pencil tool, except that we have these additional ones for snapping. So these determine what happens when you're clicking and dragging. You can see it's now snapping to this line when I get close to it. Next, let's try this with the rectangle tool. You can see that it applies the shape dynamics of our preset to the square as well. And remember, if you don't like how something turns out, you can always select it with the Select tool and then change its properties here. Why don't we set this to one with a uniform thickness? Down here at the bottom of our tool's properties, we can see that our options are mostly the same as what we've been looking at already. Except we also have this option of autofill. What this will do is automatically fill in the shapes that you draw instead of just leaving an outline. You have this option on the rectangle and the ellipse tool because they draw closed shapes. The other option we have available on the rectangle is this draw square option. If that's checked, we'll always draw a square, no matter where we put our cursor. You can get the same effect by just holding down the Shift key with that box unchecked. You can see that our ellipse tool looks virtually identical to the rectangle tool, and it essentially is. The only difference is we have the option draw circle instead of draw rectangle. So by default we draw ellipses, but with this we draw circles. Same thing as holding the Shift key. The odd man out among the shape tools is the Polyline tool. You can see that its tool properties are pretty much the same. What makes it different is the way you draw. If you click and drag, you can see that you're actually using Bezier handles to define any curve you want. This is the same as the pen tool in Illustrator. With this tool, you should be able to draw pretty much any shape you want. That's it for our shape tools. Next, let's look at how we color in our vector art.